Only that, Mr. Minister, it's your turn to reply. Before that, I'll only say that this shareholders thing, minor shareholders, that's impractical. But anyway, that we'll discuss later. Thank you.
You
have spoken from the chair, sir. You have
Sir.
spoken from the chair, sir.
Sir, despite the constraint of time, very valuable suggestions have been made by several members. In fact, one of the questions which was raised by several members is that we must consider a comprehensive legislation. And a question addressed was, why are we not having a comprehensive legislation? As I mentioned, sir, in the opening comments, that we've already had the first part of the legislation which has received the consent of both houses of parliament, which dealt with several modern concepts of corporate governance, such as sweat equity, buyback of shares, enforcement of accounting standards, investor education. That is something which we have already done last year. The important aspect which has been held back is a recommendation in relation to the forum on which corporate disputes are to be adjudicated. And the reason, and Shri Muhammad Salim also wanted to know, Shri Khan also wanted to know, what is the reason why this was held back for the present. The reason was that the Standing Committee has already made several valuable suggestions in this regard. Those are suggestions which deal with the parameters of the company's legislation. There are several aspects which have both a direct and indirect bearing on the subject, which are outside the parameters of the company legislation. For instance, two illustrations I will give. The entire gambit of law relating to the NBFCs, plantation companies, their relation to the administration and who would have control. Now, these are companies in relation to which there has been a concern in the last few years that several depositors have lost a large amount of money. Also, this whole question about commercial insolvency and the forum which will relate to commercial insolvency. As far as NBFCs are concerned, there is already a proposed legislation. As far as corporate and commercial insolvency is concerned, there are different forums. Some disputes are settled under the Companies Act, the winding up procedure, which Shri Khan said is a very tedious procedure before the High Court. There are some issues relating to commercial insolvency which go to the BIFR. There are some issues which go to the Company Law Board. And therefore, an expert committee which also would look at different legislations which have a bearing on this has already made some recommendations. The government is still in the process of taking a final view on that. And they have suggested that all these corporate issues should be taken up and referred to a company law tribunal, which would really deal with the entire gambit of issues such as resolution of commercial disputes, interest of small shareholders, NBFCs, plantation companies, and also be a forum where the question of industrial sickness as also revival could be discussed. Now, since these are all affairs which had to be dealt with comprehensively, it's that vital part of the suggestion which was made by the Standing Committee which has been currently held back, and we will finally take a comprehensive view on that forum, and which will really substantially complete the process of reform in our law relating to corporate governance. Sir, there have been several issues which have been raised, and one of the issues was in relation to corporate governance, the issue relating to functioning of the Registrar of Companies offices. Suggestions were made as to these offices have to become more efficient. You can't have heaps of papers just lying there, people not having access to these. I must mention the figure which was mentioned by Shri Khan. We have today 5,32,000 companies which are registered with the Registrar of Companies. Almost 50% of these companies are defunct companies which have not been even filing the returns. Now, these companies really exist on paper. In a large number of cases, as I said, 50% of them are not even filing their returns. And therefore, if we go back to the traditional scheme under the Act, we would have to have an oversized machinery which is busy in the process of prosecuting each one of them. And ultimately, those prosecutions would go on for a very long time. We therefore came out earlier this year with a company law settlement scheme for the year 2000. We gave an option to all defaulting companies that please file all your returns which are outstanding. And therefore, by filing them, avail the amnesty, you'll have to pay a certain amount of penalty. 100 crores was the target. And almost a very large number of them, almost 1,30,000 companies, I'm giving the approximate figure, have already availed of the amnesty, and the amount as against 100 crores which was expected is about 136 crores which have already been collected. Now we have announced a second innovative scheme, which is the second limb of this CLSS scheme, which is a fast-track exit route which we are providing to these companies. If you are no longer in business, you move and you have availed of the amnesty scheme, and even if you have not availed of the amnesty scheme, we give you a facility of now paying an additional 25% penalty and asking for an exit route, that is deregistration of the company itself. That scheme is currently going on and shall go on towards till the end of the coming month. In the process, we are trying to, and the fast track exit route is you don't go through courts, the winding up process, 30 days for a public notice and 7 days for processing the papers, and those companies would be taken off the registrar of companies and people would be absolved of those liabilities. Because we want to get out of the era where for technical defaults such as non-filing of returns, a large amount of governmental machinery is spent on merely prosecuting people. Such companies must be persuaded to go out of the register. The third part which we have brought in this law is that even if you are an originally registered company, you must have a minimum shareholding base. 1 lakh in the case of private companies, 5 lakh in the case of public companies. If you don't have it, you will have to make up for that. And therefore, all these defunct companies will have to make up for the shareholding base, which will again provide them with an incentive that just rather than be an excess baggage on the registrar of companies to go out. Now, this entire amount which has been collected from this is proposed, of course, it goes into the Consolidated Fund of India, and we have requested the Finance Ministry, who are in the process of agreeing with us, a very large amount of part of this is to be used for the reasons of modernization and transparency for updating all the offices of the Registrar of Companies. There are 22 offices currently there. If 22 offices are being computerized, the Coimbatore is the first office which is completely computerized, and we are intending that for the long-term plan for the Registrar of Companies, once it is computerized, the processes such as filing of returns, inspections should be all online. Therefore, these offices should operate in a paperless manner, as against the current system, which was rightly mentioned. There are heaps of papers lying there. Some people even misuse that excess workload which is there on the companies. Inspections are difficult, and therefore this amount, a large part of an equivalent amount, is intended to be used for this purpose. Another part of the amount, because we are intending to raise some more amount over and above this 136 crores, because once the companies come up for the exit route, some of them will have to pay a little more. A small part of this amount is also being used as a corpus for setting up an expert institute for corporate governance in India, which is going to train people and which is going to devise modern techniques, which are world-class techniques as far as corporate governance is concerned. So having said so, since these were two of the major points which were raised, I will just turn to some of the broad suggestions which have been made or questions which have been raised. Why do away with the entire process of deemed private companies beyond a certain turnover becoming deemed public companies? Now, since there has been a long-standing demand of both the industry as also the expert group which went into this whole question, that if you increase a particular amount, if you go beyond in turnover beyond a particular amount, you lose that status and become a public company. And therefore, you lose various facilities which are otherwise available to a private company. Now, it was felt that this was actually a disincentive against growth and against turnover. And considering this recommendation, it found favor with every section that this is a provision which should now be really done away with, because this is a provision which really is not in any way helping growth. A question has been raised about postal ballot, and is there a possibility of misuse of postal ballot? Sir, I may clarify that under the current administration of the Companies Act, there are two facilities which are available. One, that you can be present in the annual general meeting of the company and vote. The second is that you can give your proxy to somebody and the proxy holder will vote on your part. A criticism has been made that as a result of this system, people holding a small percentage of shares are able to collect the proxies and win and pass resolutions on the strength of those. In fact, the word occasionally used is this also results in oligarchy of certain kinds. Now a provision has been made, and this has been made keeping in view the fact that shareholders in large companies are spread all over the length and breadth of the company. These shareholders are not in a position to travel and attend the AGMs of the companies. They will have no option under the present system except to give their proxies to one of the two groups, which is in the process of collecting proxies. There could be certain such special resolutions which the government could notify, where they could use the system of postal ballot or electronic voting in lieu of the existing system. So sitting in your houses, 100%, well, if the postal machinery is not very efficient, this 100% may become 90% or 95%. But at least it would be a great improvement upon the current system, where these shareholders have only two options: either to spend thousands of rupees, travel across the country and attend AGMs, or to give their proxies to any of the major groups which is trying to collect the proxies. This really is a step forward as far as corporate democracy is concerned. Notwithstanding the limitations of the postal system which may there, this will actually enable shareholders to express their right, once it is put into effect, according to their own conscience rather than just depend upon intermediaries. Sir, question was raised with regard to the Nidhi companies. We have already received a report in relation to the Nidhi companies, because these companies have also been collecting large amount of money from innocent investors, as to the guidelines under which Nidhi companies would function. This is outside the scope of the present amendments. We have already placed that report along with the suggestions made therein on the web. These are available, and we are inviting public suggestions on this before we notify the relevant guidelines for the functioning of the Nidhi companies. An important issue relates to what is the role of the audit committee. In fact, Shri Khan mentioned that there is a slight divergence as far as the recommendations of the standing committee is concerned. It may not be so if we see the recommendations of the standing committee itself in clause 134. An audit committee, an auditor discharges a function where he has to reflect upon the true and correct state of the accounts of a company. The auditor's report therefore has a certain amount of sanctity. There are cases where auditors may adversely comment upon issues relating to the company. We have made an amendment that those issues would be highlighted in italics and not in fine print, so that the shareholder at the AGM of the company is aware of what the issues are. If the auditors give a report, it is no longer possible for the board of directors to say, I don't agree with it and I therefore ignore the entire thing. If the board disagrees with the audit committee's report, they have to refer the issue to the AGM. This was the spirit of the suggestion of the standing committee, which in the clauses 8 and 9, the language is slightly different, but which has been incorporated on a joint reading of sub-clauses 8 and 9 of the relevant clause, that the audit committee's report has now been given a sanctity. So cases where there are adverse remarks about is the functioning of the company in relation to management of its accounts, there is a larger amount of transparency which has been introduced as far as this amendment is concerned. So two issues which were raised by two of our honorable members, particularly in relation to the interest of the auditors in mind. I have examined both the issues at length. As far as the definition of the officer of the company is concerned, the honorable member and the former Chief Justice of India has expressed an opinion that on a bare reading of the definition, definition subclause 30, it is clear, it appears that the auditors are not going to be part of the officers of the company, because the board of directors does not act on the instructions of the auditors. The auditor has an independent function to perform, and therefore the fears on this may not really be very real, because the definition, when the words speak for themselves in subclause 30 and are clear so as to exclude the auditor, the apprehension need not be there. The second issue in relation to auditors which has been raised, sir, is on this capping of 20. Originally, there was a capping of 20, that is the maximum number of audits an auditor can do. Today, we have, in the interest of the auditor's profession, the chartered accountants, liberalized that provision. And the liberalized provision is that number of private companies that you audit will not really be a part of that 20. So you can audit 20 plus a number of private companies. Now, this really should have been welcomed by the profession. This fear that merely because you increase the cap or loosen the cap is not going to benefit the profession is something which ultimately it's the market forces which will determine the number of companies, the clients, the auditors will determine. If somebody is over busy, the company will look for somebody else. Now this can apply almost to every profession. There can't be a provision today where we need not, we can't, there may be several cases which may.
The limitation for an individual, because here individual certified.
If there is, I am quite aware of that argument which has been made. If there is a limitation that an individual can't do more than X number of audits, then if he is over busy, then the company will look for somebody who has time to audit. Therefore, to say,
the professional efficiency of that auditing
I'm afraid this is an issue. Therefore, if it affects the professional efficiency, there is no such provision, such gaps with regard to other professions also. Therefore, to have a fear that let not the market forces operate, but therefore we must restrict the clauses may not be a real. May not be a real.
We are trying for efficiency and transparency, but it can also affect transparency.
It is a certification, it is not market force.
It is not like your profession.
It is a provision which has been made, really, it has been liberalized in favor of the chartered accountants, and chartered accountant itself should have no real fear as far as this provision is concerned.
When the parliament is making a legislation, it cannot only think about concerned professions. I mean, we are thinking about the entire country. The entire objective is to ensure greater transparency. Now,
That's
you
exactly
create
what
a-
is being done by this bill.
You create
That is
a
exactly
situation
what is being done.
whereby a particular profession,
That is-
their efficiency will be adversely
that is
affected,
precisely
and
what
it
is
can be
being-
also manipulated. We cannot agree to that.
That is precisely that is being done. It's a facility which is being given to the legal, to the profession of chartered accountant. Sir, two, three questions which have been
Consideration
raised.
of the parliament.
One which I already in the intervention addressed. When a registered office is shifted intra-state, that is within the same state, the explanation to the section very clearly states it will only apply in those cases where there are more than one office of the registrar of companies in the state. Sir, the question has been raised with regard to offences. Offences under this section, not only have the penalties been increased tenfold, but the offences have been made cognizable under, as far as the new Act is concerned. In an environment of liberalization, when you give additional facilities for people to perform, you also keep deterrents in place that if they misconduct themselves, they will be held to be accountable to the law. Lastly, sir, an issue has been raised with regard to the representation of the small shareholders as far as the boards of the company are concerned. That's the amendment suggested, which has been suggested under section 252 of the Principal Act. So this provision is an evolving provision. This is a provision which has not been tested in many countries world over. The initial bill, when it was introduced, the bill had a provision that it would be mandatory to have a nominee of the small shareholders. Thereafter, the matter went to the standing committee. There were various kinds of views which were expressed, various apprehensions in favor and against the provision which was expressed. And also, the standing committee expressed an opinion that probably it is not required. Having taken all those views into consideration, and also the interests of the shareholders, an enabling provision has been created in accordance with the procedure which may be defined by the government. Companies on which want it would be enabled and permitted to do so, because this would otherwise have run contrary to the scheme of the Act itself. The scheme of the Act is that if you are in majority, all directors belong to you. So an enabling provision has been enacted. The enabling provision, the experimentation of how it picks up in the first instance would be seen. It would be always open for the legislature on a future date to reconsider on basis of its wisdom as to how this procedure itself has to evolve, whether it should be on a future date made mandatory or it should only remain enabling. So these are several issues which have been raised, but I may say that the object of these amendments which have been brought in, and we have a very well thought of, well advised report of the standing committee, as 40 amendments and changes suggested by the standing committee have been incorporated in it. The object is really transparency, interest of the small shareholders to be protected, interest of the small investors being protected to the extent that if depositors are not repaid back, there are serious deterrents on the company which have been imposed. And also, from the point of view of corporate governance, this law becomes a milestone in the direction of a new culture of corporate governance in this country. So I commend to this Honourable House to approve of this legislation, sir.